The Keras grid was not dying with dignity. It was screaming. Jackson Vance felt the vibration long before he heard it. It was a deep, bone-rattling shudder that traveled through the soles of his magnetic boots, up his spine, and settled into the base of his skull like a migraine. To a salvage diver like Jack, sound was usually a luxury or a warning. In the vacuum of the outer rings, you relied on haptics and the frantic flickering of your suit's HUD. But inside the inner atmosphere of the grid, where the ancient machinery processed the white dwarf's plasma, the air was thick enough to carry the sound of a world ending. "Movement!" Jackson shouted into his internal comms, though there was no one on the other end to hear him. Just a habit, a way to keep his own mind from fracturing under the pressure. He swung the kinetic grapple, the carbon fiber line snapping taut as it bit into a rotating hexagonal panel. The panel was the size of a landing pad, and it was currently glowing a violent, angry red. Above him, the Dyson-scale structure was shearing apart. Rivers of raw solar energy, stripped from the star below, poured through tectonic cracks in the shell. It looked like the universe was bleeding gold. The contract was straightforward: retrieve the core processor from Sector 7 and get out before the containment field hit zero. Nobody mentioned a survivor, especially not a high-caste etherborn. Jackson's thermal scanners spiked. A sudden bloom of heat, focused and sharp, appeared 300 meters to his left. He adjusted his visor's magnification, squinting through the haze of ionized gas. There she was. She was pinned against a stabilizing strut, her slender frame looking like a ghost against the blackened metal. Her skin, a pale, iridescent silver common to her kind, was flickering with erratic pulses of violet light. An ether-born architect. He could tell by the intricate, glowing geometry etched into her temples. They were the masters of this sector, the psychic elite who looked at humans as little more than clever monkeys with wrenches. But this architect was terrified. The containment field around her was collapsing, shrinking inward like a tightening noose of electricity. Every pulse of the field sent a fresh wave of agony through her body. Her eyes, wide and the color of burning copper, met his through the transparency of his visor. "Hold tight, princess," Jackson muttered. He didn't have a translator calibrated for her frequency, but the intent was universal. He didn't calculate the physics. If he had, he would have stayed on his original path. Instead, he kicked off the red-hot panel, using his thrusters to whip his body into a dangerous, high-velocity arc. The grapple line groaned. The tension warning on his HUD flashed amber, then red. He was asking the gear to do the impossible. Carrying 200 pounds of armored salvage suit at nearly 80 kilometers per hour toward a structural point that was currently disintegrating. He slammed into the strut inches from her. His armored hand shot out, grabbing her waist just as the energy field flickered for the final time. "Wrap your arms around my neck or we both end up as stardust," he grunted, the words lost to her, but the motion clear. She didn't hesitate. It was the first thing that surprised him. Usually her kind would rather die than touch a dust crawler like him. But she clung to his chest plating with a strength born of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. Her fingers dug into the modular seams of his suit. Jackson hit the release on his primary grapple and fired the secondary. They fell for 5 seconds of terrifying freefall, the white dwarf stars swirling below them like a drain of fire. Then the line caught. The jolt nearly dislocated Jackson's shoulder, but he held on. They swung through the thickening smoke, clearing the collapse zone by less than 30 meters. Behind them, the strut she had been standing on vanished in a silent, blinding implosion of light. "I've got you," Jackson wheezed, his lungs burning from the G-force. "Just stay still." She didn't stay still. She pressed her face against his chest, her entire body shaking. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, even through the multi-layer insulation of his suit. It wasn't just heat, it was a hum, a vibration that felt like 1,000 whispers trying to find a way into his head. He ignored it. He had a ship to reach. The Drift Ghost was docked 3 kilometers away in a pressurized airlock that was currently losing its seal. Jackson moved with the practiced efficiency of 15 years in the trade. He used the grapple, his thrusters, and the occasional desperate leap across widening chasms of metal. All the while, the woman never let go. She was like a part of his armor now, a silent, silver shadow fused to his side. They reached the airlock with 2 minutes to spare. The heavy blast doors groaned as they cycled, protesting the grit and debris in their tracks. Jackson shoved her inside, scrambled in after her, and slammed the manual override. The silence that followed was deafening. No more screaming star, no more groaning metal, just the hiss of oxygen and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He reached up to unlatch his helmet. The seal broke with a sharp hiss of pressure equalization. Jackson took a deep breath of the recycled, metallic air of the ship and looked down at the woman. She had crawled into the corner of the small airlock, her eyes still fixed on him. The violet light in her skin had calmed to a soft, steady throb. She looked exhausted, broken, and utterly out of place on a battered salvage vessel. "Listen, I don't know who you are or why you were still on that rock," Jackson said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But we need to move. This whole sector is about to go dark." He reached out a hand to help her up. She flinched, not in fear, but as if the movement itself were a physical blow. Then her eyes changed. The copper color deepened, and she stared at his hand as if it were the most fascinating thing in the universe. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she lunged forward and grabbed his forearm, pulling herself close to him again. "Hey, easy," Jackson barked, trying to pull away. "I'm not going to hurt you." She made a sound then. It wasn't a word. It was a low, melodic trill that vibrated in the air between them. Her grip didn't loosen. If anything, she held on tighter, her iridescent skin pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "What the hell did I just pick up?" Jackson muttered to the empty airlock. He didn't know then that the contract for the core processor was the least of his problems. He didn't know that for the next 72 hours, she wouldn't let him get more than an arm's length away. And he certainly didn't know that in a galaxy where everyone was shouting, he was the only thing that was truly quiet. He just knew he needed a drink and a very long nap. But as he looked into her wide amber eyes, he realized he wasn't going to get either. The Drift Ghost was a mess of exposed wiring, grease-stained bulkheads, and the lingering smell of ozone. It was a 20-year-old hauler that Jackson had spent nearly half his life keeping together with spit, prayers, and illegal engine parts. It was home. But as he sat in the pilot's chair, the ship felt smaller than usual. Lumina, though he didn't know her name yet, was sitting in the co-pilot's seat. She wasn't just sitting in it. She was huddled, her knees pulled to her chest, one hand firmly clamped onto Jackson's left bicep. "Look, Princess, I need both hands to fly," Jackson said, gesturing toward the navigation console. "We're still in the gravity well of a dying star. If I don't hit the burn in 10 seconds, we're both going to be part of the scenery." She didn't move. She looked at his mouth as he spoke, her head tilted like a bird's. Her expression was intense, a mix of profound relief and an almost clinical curiosity. When he tried to gently pry her fingers loose, she let out a sharp, hissed breath, and her grip tightened until his armor groaned. "Fine. Fine. Fly with one hand. I've done it drunk. I can do it with an alien attachment," Jackson grumbled. He slammed the throttle forward with his right hand. The Drift Ghost's engines roared, a twin-ion scream that pushed them deep into their seats. The ship vibrated violently as it broke free of the Carys grid's crumbling magnetic tethers. On the monitors, the massive Dyson structure looked like a shattered eggshell, spilling the white-hot yolk of the star into the void. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. 1,000,000,000 credits of engineering, gone in a cosmic heartbeat. Once they reached the safety of the jump gate corridor, Jackson engaged the autopilot. He let out a long, shaky breath and turned to face his passenger. She hadn't looked at the explosion once. Her eyes had never left him. "My name is Jackson," he said, pointing to himself. "Jax." She mimicked the movement, her finger touching the stencil on his chest plate. Jax," she whispered. Her voice was like silver bells muffled by velvet. It was beautiful, and it made the hair on his arm stand up. "And you?" he asked. She closed her eyes for a moment. The patterns on her skin shifted, swirling in complex spirals of blue and gold. Then she looked at him and spoke a string of syllables that sounded like a song. "Whoa, slow down. I don't speak. Whatever that is." She frowned, seemingly frustrated. She reached out and touched his temple. Jackson jumped back, his chair spinning. "No, none of that psychic mojo. I don't do head prodding. The Etherborn were famous for it. They could peel your mind like an orange, seeing your secrets and your shames before you could even blink. Jekin had spent his life avoiding their enlightenment. In the scrap yards of the Outer Rim, people like him were called nulls or voids. They were the lucky ones whose brains didn't broadcast a signal, making them invisible to the psychic elite. Lumina looked hurt. The violet light in her skin dimmed to a dull, bruised gray. She pulled her hand back and tucked it under her arm. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, his voice softening despite himself. I like my thoughts where they are, inside my head." She watched him for a long time. Then she did something unexpected. She didn't try to touch his mind again. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, placing it against her own cheek. Her skin was cool, like polished stone, but there was a thrum beneath it. "Quiet," she said. It was a human word. Clumsy, mispronounced, but unmistakable. "Quiet," he repeated. She nodded fervently, pointing to his chest, then to her own head. "No noise." "You? No noise." Jackson frowned. "What do you mean? Everyone's got noise." "My head's a mess of bills I can't pay and engine parts I need to find." She shook her head, her copper eyes filling with tears. "Everyone screams. Always. The stars, the people, the ships. 1,000 voices. Too much." She pressed her palms against her ears, her expression one of sudden, sharp agony. Then she leaned forward until her forehead was resting against Jackson's shoulder. "But you," she whispered, "you are the silence." Jackson sat frozen. He'd heard the rumors, of course, that the Etherborn were so connected to their echo link that they could never truly be alone. They lived in a constant sea of each other's thoughts, a never-ending broadcast of a billion minds. To a species like that, a human like Jackson, a man whose mind was a literal dead zone, wasn't just a curiosity. He was a sanctuary. He looked down at the silver-skinned woman clinging to him. For the first time, he didn't see a haughty architect of a superior race. He saw someone who had been drowning in a crowd and had finally found a single square inch of dry land. "Is that why you won't let go?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I'm the only place where you can't hear them?" She didn't answer with words. She just leaned into him, her breathing finally slowing into a steady, rhythmic pace. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked like she might actually sleep. Jackson looked out at the stars through the cockpit glass. He was a salvage diver. He was used to picking up broken things and trying to find their value. Usually it was a cracked power core or a bent hull plate. He didn't know how to fix a broken architect. "We're heading to Obsidian Reach," he told her, though she was already drifting off. "There's a medic there, a guy named Splint. He doesn't ask questions if the credits are good. He'll look at that burn on your arm." He reached out tentatively and rested his hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch this time. She hummed a soft, contented sound that vibrated through his bones. But Jackson knew the Reach wasn't safe. If her people were looking for her, and they definitely were, they wouldn't stop until they found their missing architect. And if they found out that a void walker like him was holding on to her, they wouldn't just take her back. They'd want to know why he was quiet. They'd want to open him up to see how the silence worked. He looked at his taped knuckles, then at the woman sleeping against him. "I guess we're both in the soup now, Princess," he muttered. The drift ghost slipped into the jump gate, the stars stretching into long, brilliant needles of light. Outside, the galaxy was screaming. But inside the cockpit, for the first time in either of their lives, there was only the silence. And for now, that was enough. Obsidian Reach was less of a space station and more of a collective mechanical nightmare clinging to the side of a massive carbonaceous asteroid. It looked like a graveyard of ships that had forgotten how to die, their hulls welded together into a chaotic lattice of pressurized corridors and venting gas. In the lawless sectors of the Outer Rim, it was the only place where a man like Jackson Vance could disappear without being asked why he was bleeding. The drift ghost banked hard as it approached the docking ring. Jason kept one hand on the flight stick and the other pinned under Lumina's grip. She hadn't moved for nearly 6 hours. Her breathing was a soft, rhythmic, haptic pulse against his side, a constant reminder that he was no longer alone in his own skin. Ghost to reach control, Jackson grunted into the comms. I'm coming in on pad 19. Have the docking clamps ready, or I'm scraping the paint off your station. A voice crackled back, thick with the accent of the belt. 19 is reserved for the heavy hitters, Ghost. You got the marks to pay for it, or are you just blowing smoke? Check the registry, Jackson snapped. I've got 50,000 marks in escrow from the Karis job. Now lock me in before I lose my patience in your airlock. There was a pause, then the sound of several switches flipping. All right. Don't get your suit in a twist. Pad 19 is open. Watch the approach. We've got a fuel leak on the adjacent bay. Jackson didn't respond. He guided the ship through the narrow needle eye of the docking ring with the kind of muscle memory that only comes from a decade of dodging debris. The clamps engaged with a heavy metallic thud that echoed through the hull. The engines whined as they powered down, the blue glow of the ion thrusters fading into the dim, red emergency lights of the hangar. We're here, Princess, Jackson said, turning his head. Lumina stirred. Her eyes opened, the copper irises glowing with a renewed intensity. She looked at the viewport, her gaze sweeping over the rusted bulkheads and flickering neon signs of the station. Noisy, she whispered. Yeah, well, that's Obsidian Reach for you, Jackson said, finally managing to pull his arm free. It's loud, it's dirty, and it smells like a recycled gym bag. But nobody here cares about your lineage. He stood up, his joints popping after the long flight. He reached for his utility belt, checking the charge on his kinetic pulse pistol. He wasn't expecting trouble, but expecting nothing was a good way to end up in a body bag in this part of the galaxy. Lumina stood with him, her movements fluid and hauntingly graceful compared to his heavy, clanking stride. She stayed within 2 feet of him, her hand occasionally reaching out to brush against his shoulder, as if to confirm he hadn't turned into a hologram. I need you to keep that hood up, Jackson warned, handing her a tattered gray cloak he'd found in the storage locker. If people see an ether-born architect walking around a scrapper station, we'll have a riot or a kidnapping before we hit the first corner. She took the cloak, her fingers lingering on the rough fabric. She pulled it over her head, the silver iridescence of her skin disappearing into the shadows. Better, Jackson said. Now let's go find Splint. The hangar deck was a chaotic mess of cargo sleds, refueling drones, and roughneck crews. Men and women from a dozen different star systems were shouting, cursing, and lugging crates of black market tech. Jackson moved through the crowd like a ghost. His void mind made him invisible to the few psychic sensors the station security might have had, but his reputation did the rest. People moved out of his way when they saw the scowl on his face and the way he carried himself. Lumina walked in his shadow. Jackson could feel her agitation. The patterns on her skin, visible only through the gaps in her cloak, were moving in jagged, staccato rhythms. To her, this station wasn't just a place, it was a sensory assault. Every mind in the Reach was broadcasting greed, hunger, anger, and desperation. To a high-caste telepath, it must have felt like being drowned in a sea of acid. Keep your head down, Jackson muttered. We're almost there. They turned down a narrow alleyway in the lower ring, where the walls were slick with condensation and the air tasted of ozone. A flickering sign above a reinforced door read, Repairs, Bio and Tech. Jackson didn't knock. He kicked the door open. Inside, the air was sterile and cold. The room was filled with the hum of medical monitors and the soft whirring of multi-armed surgical drones. A man with 4 cybernetic arms and a visor that covered his entire upper face was hunched over a workbench, soldering a neural bridge. Splint, Jackson said. The man didn't look up. You're late, Vance, and you smell like a Dyson Sphere's backside. Did you get the processor, or am I wasting my time waiting for my cut? The job went south, Jackson said, stepping further into the room. But I've got something else. Splint turned his visor toward them. His 4 mechanical arms retracted into a defensive posture. He looked at Jackson, then his gaze drifted to the cloaked figure behind him. Who's the stray? Splint asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Show him, Jackson said. Lumina hesitated, then pulled back her hood. The iridescent glow of her skin illuminated the dark room like a captured star. Splint froze. His visor clicked as he shifted through different spectrums, analyzing her biological signature. By the great void, Splint whispered. That's a high-caste. Vance, tell me you didn't kidnap an architect. Tell me you're not that stupid. I rescued her, Jackson snapped. The grid collapsed. She was the only one left. She's got burns, Splint, and she's not doing well. Splint walked toward them, his mechanical arms twitching. He stopped 5 feet away. She's terrified, he noted, his voice dropping the sarcasm. Her biorhythms are off the charts. She's projecting enough distress to kill a normal telepath. She can't turn it off, Jackson said. I can't touch her, Splint said, shaking his head. If I get close with these sensors, she'll fry my processors or I'll fry her nervous system. She's too sensitive. Lumina looked at Splint, then at the various medical instruments on the table. She made that low, growling sound again, her skin pulsing a warning violet. She won't let anyone near her, Jackson explained, except me. Splint looked at Jackson, then back at the woman. Why you? You're a void, Vance. To her kind, you're a walking dead zone. You're a hole in the universe. I don't know, Jackson said, feeling a sudden, strange defensiveness. But if you want to get paid, you're going to have to walk me through the treatment. I'll do the work. You just tell me which buttons to push. Splint sighed, his mechanical arm sagging. Fine. Put her on the table. If we don't seal those burns, she'll go into neuroshock within 12 hours. Jackson led Lumina to the exam table. She didn't want to let go of his hand, but he guided her down with a gentleness that surprised even him. Stay still, princess, he whispered. I'm right here. For the next 2 hours, Jackson followed Splint's instructions. He cleaned the electrical burns on her iridescent skin with a cooling gel that smelled of mint and chemicals. He applied dermal sealants to the deep scoring along her arms. Each time he touched her, her skin rippled with color, a slow, soothing wave of blue that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Splint watched from the corner, his visor clicking as he recorded the data. This is incredible, the medic murmured. Her neural network is trying to sync with your baseline. She's using your lack of psychic output as a stabilizer. It's like she's using you as a noise-canceling anchor. Is it permanent? Jackson asked, his hands steady as he wrapped a gauze strip around her forearm. Splint shrugged. In my experience, once a bond like this forms in a crisis, it's not something you just turn off. She's imprinted on you, Vance. You're not just her rescuer anymore. You're her oxygen. Jackson looked down at Lumina. She had fallen into a light sleep, her hand still resting on his thigh. She looked so fragile, so entirely removed from the powerful, arrogant architects he had seen in the vids. She's a person, Jackson said, mostly to himself. Splint let out a dry, hacking laugh. To the Etherborn, she's a billion-mark asset. To the High Arbitrator, she's a security leak. And to you, she's a death sentence. Jackson finished the last bandage and stood up. I've survived death sentences before. Yeah, but you've never had to carry one with you, Splint countered. Get out of here, Vance. Take the back tunnels to the locker. I've already sent the codes to your comms. Stay off the main walkways. There are retrieval teams already landing on the upper decks. Who told them? Jackson asked, his hand drifting to his pistol. The grid didn't just die, Splint said, turning back to his workbench. It signaled. Every sensor in 3 light years knows you pulled something out of that fire. Now move before they find a way to track the silence. Jackson woke Lumina gently. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and for a moment, the fear was gone. There was only a quiet, profound trust that made his chest feel tight. Time to move, Jackson said. We've got a long walk ahead of us. They stepped out into the cold, damp air of the alleyway. Jackson checked the corners, his eyes sharp for any sign of a silver suit or a psychic pulse. He felt a new kind of weight in his gut. It wasn't the fear of dying. He'd made his peace with that years ago. It was the fear of failing someone who had no one else to turn to. He looked at Lumina, her hood pulled low, her hand finding his in the dark. I've got you, he whispered into the shadows. I've got you. The locker was a safe house that lived up to its name. It was a reinforced shipping container buried deep within the asteroid's secondary crust, accessible only through a series of decommissioned air vents and a manual hatch that hadn't seen grease in a decade. It was cramped, cold, and smelled of rust, but it was the most secure place on Obsidian Reach. Jackson closed the hatch and spun the locking wheel until the seals hissed. He didn't turn on the lights immediately, relying on the green glow of his suit's HUD. He checked the perimeter sensors, small, kinetic-triggered mines he'd placed in the vents on the way in. Everything was quiet, for now. He finally hit the manual switch. A single, flickering light strip on the ceiling buzzed to life, casting long, shaky shadows across the room. "Home, sweet home," Jackson muttered, tossing his helmet onto the single bunk. Lumina stood in the center of the room, her hood still up. She looked around the small space with a quiet intensity. To her, this wasn't just a room, it was a cage. But as she felt the absolute stillness of the reinforced walls, the tension in her shoulders began to bleed away. "Quiet," she said again, her voice a soft echo. "Yeah, 3 meters of lead-lined carbonite will do that for you," Jackson said. He walked over to a small food synthesizer in the corner. It was an old model, the kind that produced blocks of nutritional paste that tasted like wet cardboard. He punched in a sequence and waited for the machine to groan. "You need to eat," he said, handing her a lukewarm tray. "I don't know what your people usually dine on. Starfire and rainbows, I imagine. But this is all we've got." Lumina took the tray, her fingers brushing against his. She looked at the gray paste with a frown, then up at Jackson. "You eat this?" she asked. "Every day for 15 years, Jackson said, taking a seat on a crate across from her. "It keeps the heart beating and the lungs moving. That's all that matters out here." Lumina sat on the edge of the bunk. She took a small bite, her expression shifting from curiosity to mild disgust. But she kept eating. She was a survivor, Jackson realized. She might be a high-caste architect, but she had the steel of someone who knew the value of a full stomach. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her amber eyes locking onto his. "Why what?" Jackson replied, his mouth full of paste. "Why save?" She gestured to herself, then to the room. "I am ether-born. You are dust. My people. Not kind to yours." Jackson stopped chewing. He looked at the floor, the memory of the Carey's grid flickering in his mind. He saw the fire, the collapsing struts, and the look in her eyes when she thought she was going to die. "I don't know," Jackson said, his voice rough. "Maybe I was tired of seeing things break. Maybe I just didn't like the way that field was closing in on you. It didn't feel right." He stood up and walked to the small viewport that looked out into the dark, jagged interior of the asteroid. "My people have a word for what you are," he said without turning around. "They call you the Echo, because you're always repeating everyone else's thoughts. You're never just yourselves. You're a reflection of the crowd." Lumina was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice small and haunted. "It is a storm. From the moment we wake to the moment we sleep. We hear the love, the hate, the hunger. We are never alone. We are 1,000 minds all screaming at once." She walked over to him, her footsteps silent on the metal floor. She stood beside him, her iridescent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. "Until you," she whispered. "When you grabbed me." The storm stopped. It was like stepping into a room and closing the door. I could hear my own heart. I could hear my own breath. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers trailing over the scars on his skin. "You are a void, Jackson. But to me, you are the only solid thing in the universe." Jackson felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pity. It was a strange, terrifying sense of responsibility. He'd spent his life being a ghost, a man who belonged nowhere and to no one. But to this woman, he was everything. "I used to hate your kind," Jackson said, the confession slipping out before he could stop it. Lumina tilted her head. "Why?" 10 years ago, I was working a salvage job on a freighter near the Arcturus belt. It was a civilian ship, full of families. An ether-born retrieval team showed up. They were looking for a political dissident. They didn't want to waste time searching the ship, so they broadcast a neural purge. He squeezed his eyes shut, the sound of the screaming passengers still echoing in the dark corners of his mind. "They didn't kill anyone," he continued, his voice shaking, "but they broke them. Everyone on that ship. Their minds were wiped clean. They became shells. My sister was on that ship. She didn't even recognize me when I found her. She just stared at the ceiling and hummed a song that wasn't there. He looked at Lumina, his eyes hard and full of old pain. To your people, we're just background noise. We're collateral damage. So yeah, I had a lot of reasons to let you burn in that sphere. Lumina didn't pull away. She didn't look offended or defensive. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, pulling it to her chest. He could feel her heart racing, a frantic thrumming beneath her silver skin. I am sorry, she whispered. Truly. My people, they forget the individual. They see only the network. They think that because you are quiet, you do not feel. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, Jackson saw the depth of her own suffering. She wasn't just an architect. She was a prisoner of her own biology. I chose to be alone on the grid, she said. I volunteered for the assessment because I wanted to be away from the echo. I wanted to find a place where the noise was soft. I didn't know the star would break. I didn't know I would find someone who was truly silent. They stood there for a long time, two broken pieces of different worlds, held together by a silence that was more powerful than any signal. Jackson was the first to pull away. He cleared his throat, the practicalities of their situation reasserting themselves. We need to sleep, he said. I'll take the floor. You take the bunk. Lumina started to protest, but he waved her off. Don't argue, princess. You're still recovering. I've slept on harder surfaces than this during a standard EVA run. She climbed into the bunk, her eyes never leaving him as he settled onto a pile of old flight jackets on the floor. He turned off the light, leaving them in the heavy, lead-lined darkness of the locker. Jackson, she whispered in the dark. Yeah, thank you. For not being like them. Jackson didn't answer. He just stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He was 37 years old, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't just running from something. He was running for someone. He closed his eyes, expecting the usual nightmares of fire and screaming ships. But instead, he felt a strange, cooling sensation at the edge of his consciousness. It was like a soft blue light, gentle and steady. He fell asleep to the sound of a heart that wasn't his, beating in perfect sync with the silence. The peace didn't last. 3 hours later, the proximity sensor in the secondary air vent tripped. It wasn't a loud alarm, just a sharp, rhythmic ping on Jackson's wrist comms. He was awake in an instant, his hand already on his pistol. He didn't make a sound. He just rolled to his feet and pressed his back against the wall next to the hatch. Lumina was already sitting up, her eyes glowing in the dark. She looked at the ceiling, her skin pulsing a frantic electric yellow. They are here, she whispered, her voice trembling. Who? Jackson asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. The specialists, she said. I can hear them. They are looking for the void. They are looking for you. Jackson checked the monitor on his comms. A thermal signature was moving through the vents, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a scrapper or a station guard. The heat signature was too clean, too controlled. Retrieval team, Jackson muttered. He looked at Lumina. Her face was pale, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The noise was back. The hunters were broadcasting a psychic search grid, a high-frequency scream that was designed to flush out hidden minds. I can't breathe, she gasped, clutching her head. Jackson didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. He pressed her head against his chest, wrapping his heavy, armored arms around her. Focus on me, he commanded. Don't listen to them. Listen to the silence. Listen to my heart. He felt her body go rigid. Then slowly, agonizingly, she began to relax. The yellow light in her skin faded, replaced by a dull, steady blue. The psychic scream was still there, pounding against the walls of the locker, but Jackson's presence acted like a physical barrier. He was the lead lining in her soul. We're going to have to fight our way out, Jackson said, his voice a low growl. Lumina looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear but also a new, fierce determination. No, she said. We are going to run. I know the station's grid. I can open the paths they do not see. Jackson looked at her. For the first time, he saw the architect, the woman who could map a Dyson sphere in her head. All right, princess, Jackson said, a grim smile touching his lips. You point the way. I'll clear the air. He checked the charge on his pistol and primed a smoke grenade. The hunt was on, but the hunters didn't know one thing. They were hunting a ghost, and ghosts don't like to be found. Jackson kicked the manual override on the hatch. The heavy door swung open with a groan of metal. Outside, the corridor was filled with a thick, artificial mist, and the sound of heavy boots echoed from the darkness. "Let's go," Jackson said, grabbing her hand. They stepped out into the fog, two shadows moving in a world of signals, bound together by the only honest thing left in the galaxy. The silence was over. The war had begun. The gut of Obsidian Reach was where the station's dreams went to rot. It was a subterranean labyrinth of pressurized pipes, gargantuan heat exchangers, and the constant rhythmic thrum of the atmosphere scrubbers that kept 300,000 souls from suffocating in the dark. Down here, the light was a sickly, flickering amber, filtered through layers of industrial grease and the hazy smoke of illegal refineries. Jackson Vance led the way, his pulse pistol unholstered and held low against his thigh. He moved with a predatory grace, his boots barely making a sound on the rusted floor plating. Behind him, Lumina was a silver specter in her gray cloak, her hand clutching the back of his tactical vest. Every time a pipe hissed or a rat scurried through the shadows, her grip tightened until he felt the reinforced seams of his gear groan. "Move it, Lumina," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of a nearby turbine. "We've got 2 kilometers of this sludge before we hit the maintenance elevator. If we're lucky, the specialists are still checking the upper manifests." "They won't be," she replied, her voice trembling but certain. "They have already touched the air of the locker. They know the scent of the silence. It is a hole in their map. They will follow the absence." "Great," Jackson grunted. "So being a void is like walking around with a giant neon sign that says, 'Nothing to see here. Just my luck.'" They ducked under a low-hanging coolant line, the liquid inside gurgling like a dying beast. The air was getting thicker, laden with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the sweat of the thousands who lived in the dross, the lowest residential level of the station. These were the people who didn't have marks for the neon-lit plazas or the pressurized suites. They were the engine grunts, the pipe crawlers, and the desperate who had nowhere else to go. As they emerged into a wider junction, Jackson froze. The junction was crowded. Dozens of people were huddled around a central heating vent, their faces hollow and their eyes glazed with exhaustion. But they weren't just tired, they were suffering. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the air, a psychic residue left by the retrieval specialist's search grid. To Jackson, it was just a faint pressure in his ears, like a change in altitude. But to the people in the junction, those who weren't voids but weren't psychics either, it was a persistent, agonizing headache. "Look at them," Lumina whispered, her hand trembling as she pulled back her hood just an inch. Jackson didn't want to look. He knew what happened when the Etherborn played with their toys. The dross dwellers were clutching their heads, some rocking back and forth, others staring at nothing with tears streaming down their soot-stained faces. It was a mop-up effect. The specialists didn't care about the collateral damage. They were broadcasting at a frequency that scraped the insides of a human mind just to see if anything interesting rattled. "We can't stop," Jackson said, his voice hard. He tried to step around a woman who had collapsed near the vent, her hands clawing at the deck plating. "Jackson?" "She is in pain," Lumina said, her copper eyes wide with a sudden, sharp clarity. "The echo they are using, it is too sharp. It is tearing at her." "It's not our problem, Lumina," Jackson snapped, grabbing her shoulder to pull her forward. "If we stop to play medic, the specialists will be on us in 5 minutes. These people are they're just the background. They'll recover when the grid moves on." "No," Lumina said, pulling away from him. She knelt beside the collapsed woman. Her iridescent skin began to pulse, not with the frantic yellow of fear, but with a deep, resonant violet. "Lumina, bug out. Now!" Jackson hissed, checking the corridor behind them. She ignored him. She placed her hands on the woman's temples. The violet light flowed from her fingers, a gentle wave of energy that seemed to wash over the sufferer. The woman's breathing slowed. Her hands stopped clawing at the metal. A look of profound peace crossed her face, and she let out a long, shaky breath before falling into a deep, natural sleep. Lumina stood up, her face pale. She looked at the dozens of others in the junction, her expression one of immense sorrow. "My people, we do this," she said softly. "We see the dust as nothing but clay to be molded. We do not hear their pain because we are too busy listening to our own power." Jackson looked at the sleeping woman, then back at Lumina. For a moment, his prejudice wavered. He'd spent a decade thinking the Etherborn were nothing but psychic vampires, incapable of seeing a human as anything other than a tool. But here was one of their elite, risking her life and her energy to soothe a nameless scrapper in a grease pit. "Fine," Jackson said, his voice losing some of its edge. "But that's the last one. We're out of time." He pulled her toward the next tunnel, but as they turned the corner, the air suddenly went cold. The flickering amber lights of the junction died, plunged into a deep, oppressive darkness. Jackson's HUD flickered, the thermal sensors struggling to lock onto something that shouldn't be there. "Contact!" Jackson yelled, shoving Lumina behind a stack of rusted cargo crates. From the darkness of the far corridor, 3 figures emerged. They didn't walk. They seemed to glide, their silver suits reflecting the faint green glow of Jackson's suit lights. They wore helmets with no visors, just smooth, mirrored surfaces that hid their faces. These weren't the retrieval grunts from the hangar. These were the arbitrator's personal guard. "Voidwalker," a voice echoed in Jackson's mind. It wasn't a sound, but a cold, oily sensation that made his skin crawl. "You are carrying property that does not belong to you. Relinquish the architect, and your death will be swift." Jackson leveled his pistol at the lead figure. "I've got 50,000 marks, says you're full of it, Sparky." He didn't wait for a response. He fired. The kinetic bolt slammed into the lead guard's chest, but it didn't pierce. A shimmering blue barrier flared into existence, absorbing the impact and dissipating it into the air. "Lumina, get to the vent!" Jackson yelled, firing again and again. The guards raised their hands. Jackson felt the air thicken, a massive wall of psychic pressure slamming into him. It was like being hit by a freight train made of silence. He fell back against the crates, the breath driven from his lungs. His vision blurred, the green glow of his HUD spinning. He felt a hand on his chest. Lumina was there, her skin blazing with a fierce, blinding white light. "No!" she screamed. "Not him!" She didn't use a weapon. She used herself. She projected a wave of raw, unfiltered psychic energy, a shout of pure silence that shattered the guards' barriers and sent them sprawling across the floor. The feedback was immense. The pipes in the corridor groaned and burst, spraying hot steam into the air. Lumina collapsed against Jackson, her skin dimming to a ghost-like gray. Jackson grabbed her, his own head ringing from the blast. He didn't think. He just acted. He threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and bolted into the steam. He found the maintenance hatch she had pointed out earlier and kicked it open, sliding down a grease-slicked chute that led deeper into the station's foundations. They tumbled out onto a heap of discarded insulation foam 40 meters below. Jackson scrambled to his feet, checking Lumina's vitals. She was breathing, but her pulse was thready. The shout had cost her dearly. He looked around. They were in a low-G waste processing zone. Massive fans turned slowly above them, their blades cutting through the hazy air like giant scythes. "We're not in the clear," Jackson whispered, his voice cracking. "But we're still moving." He looked at Lumina's pale face. He'd seen her power, but he'd also seen her heart. The lines he had drawn in the sand, dust versus divine, void versus echo, were starting to blur. And in the dark of the waste zone, he realized that the biggest danger wasn't the specialists. It was the fact that he was starting to care if she survived. The waste zone was a cavernous, echoing vault where the station's trash was compressed into 500-kilogram cubes and shot into the void. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of rotting organic matter and industrial chemicals, but to Jackson, it was the smell of safety. The heavy lead shielding used to line the incinerators acted as a natural dampener for psychic signals. For the first time in hours, he felt the pressure in his head completely vanish. He laid Lumina down on a relatively clean pile of foam and sat back against a vibrating conveyor belt. His armor felt like it weighed 1,000 kilograms. He reached up and unlatched his helmet, letting it clatter to the floor. The air was cold and damp, stinging his sweaty face. Lumina stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at the massive fans above them, her expression dazed. Did we make it? She whispered. We're alive, Jackson said, pulling a canteen from his belt and offering it to her. Drink. You've got the shakes. She took a sip, the water spilling down her chin. She looked at her hands, which were still trembling. The iridescent patterns on her skin were erratic, like a broken circuit board. I used the echo, she said, her voice full of shame. I did what they do. I forced my mind into the world. I broke the silence. You saved our backsides, Jackson countered. If you hadn't done that, we'd be sitting in a retrieval cell right now with our brains being turned into smoothies. Don't apologize for being good at what you do. But it felt wrong, she said, clutching the canteen to her chest. To use the power like a hammer, it is what the arbitrator wants. He wants to weaponize the silence. He wants to know how to make a mind that cannot be touched so he can use it to crush everyone else. Jackson stayed quiet. He thought about his sister, staring at that ceiling in the Arcturus belt. He thought about the guard's voice in his head, cold and oily. He'd spent his whole life thinking that power like Lumina's was the enemy. But power was just a tool. It was the hand that held it that mattered. Why did you help that woman back there? Jackson asked suddenly. In the dross. You knew we were being hunted. You knew it would slow us down. Lumina looked at him, her copper eyes softening. Because I could hear her, Jackson. Not her thoughts. Her being. She was a single, beautiful note in a song that was being drowned out by a scream. I couldn't just let the note disappear. She reached out and touched Jackson's hand. You call yourself a void. You think you are nothing because you don't broadcast. But you are the most solid thing I have ever known. You don't scream, Jackson. You just exist. And in that existence, there is room for others to breathe. Jackson looked away, his throat tight. I'm just a scrapper, Lumina. I've spent 37 years looking for junk in the dark. I'm not a room. I'm just a guy with a gun and a bad attitude. No, she insisted. You are the architect of a different kind of world. One where the noise doesn't matter. Before he could respond, a soft, rhythmic clicking sound echoed from the far end of the vault. Jackson was on his feet in a second, his pistol raised. The green light of his suit's power cell flickered. Who's there? He barked. A figure stepped out from behind a trash compressor. It wasn't a silver-clad guard. It was a man, short and squat, wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit and a breathing mask that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap. He held his hands up in a universal gesture of peace. Easy, Vance. It's just me, the man shouted. Jackson lowered his gun, but only slightly. Kyle, what the hell are you doing down here? Kyle was a runner, one of the many intermediaries who handled the logistics for Jackson's salvage contracts. He was a human, a dust crawler to his core, and usually he was the most reliable man on the station. I've been looking for you since the Karis job went dark, Kyle said, stepping closer. The arbitrator's people are tearing the station apart. They've blocked the primary docks and they're scanning every ship that tries to bug out. You're in deep, Jax. Deeper than I've ever seen you. Tell me something I don't know, Jackson grunted. Did you get the ship ready? I've got the Drift Ghost on a secondary tether in the service bay, Kale said, his eyes darting to Lumina. But we've got a problem. The arbitrator isn't just looking for the girl. He's looking for the void who rescued her. He's put a bounty on your head, Jax. 100,000 marks, dead or alive. Jackson let out a low whistle. 100,000? I didn't know I was worth that much. Kale didn't laugh. Jax, listen, I can get you out. I've got a bypass for the service gate, but I can't take her. He pointed a shaking finger at Lumina. If she's on that ship, the psychic sensors will pick us up the moment we break atmosphere. They'll flatline all of us before we hit the jump gate. You have to leave her, Jax. Give her back to the specialists. Tell them you were just holding her for ransom. They'll give you the marks, and you can disappear to the rim. Lumina froze, her iridescent skin turning a cold, translucent white. She looked at Jackson, her amber eyes searching his face for any sign of betrayal. Jackson looked at Kale. Then he looked at the marks on his hand where Lumina had held him. He thought about the 100,000 marks, more money than he'd seen in his entire life. He could buy a new ship. He could retire to a garden world and never have to smell recycled oxygen again. He could finally be safe. Then he thought about the woman in the dross. He thought about the silence. "Kyle," Jackson said softly, "you've known me for 10 years. "Yeah, I have," Kyle said, stepping forward. "That's why I'm telling you this. Don't throw your life away for a copper top who wouldn't look at you twice if she wasn't scared. She's an etherborn, Jax. She's the enemy." Jackson walked over to Kale. He looked the man in the eye. "The enemy is the one who thinks they can decide what a person is worth," Jackson said. He didn't hit Kale. He just grabbed him by the front of his jumpsuit and shoved him back against the compressor. "You go back to the service bay. You tell them you couldn't find me. If I see you again, I won't be so polite. Now bug out before I change my mind about letting you keep your mask." Kyle scrambled away, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. He didn't say another word as he vanished into the shadows of the waste zone. Jackson turned back to Lumina. She was standing now, her cloak wrapped tightly around her. She looked like she wanted to cry, but her eyes were fierce. "You should have gone," she whispered. He was right. "I am a death sentence for you." Jackson walked over to her and handed her the helmet he'd dropped. "Put it on, princess. We're going to the service bay, and we're not leaving anyone behind." "Why?" she asked. "Why stay with me?" "Because I made a choice," Jackson said, his voice steady, "and I'm too stubborn to change it now. Besides, the silence is starting to grow on me." He checked the charge on his pistol. 2 shots left, 1 kinetic, 1 ion. Not enough to take on an army, but enough to make a statement. "We're not going out the front door," Jackson said, looking up at the massive exhaust fans. "We're going to climb." Lumina looked at the spinning blades. "You are mad, Jackson Vance." "Probably," he agreed. "But that's the best thing about being a void. Nobody can hear what I'm thinking." As they began the long, treacherous climb up the waste conveyor, Jackson felt a strange sense of clarity. He had rejected the marks. He had rejected the easy way out. He had chosen the girl over the world he knew. He was starting to realize that the nothing inside his head wasn't an absence at all. It was a foundation. And for the first time in his life, he was building something on it that wasn't made of scrap metal. The turning point had come and gone. There was no going back now. Above them, the exhaust fans roared like the heartbeat of the station, and somewhere in the dark, the specialists were waiting. But Jackson Vance didn't care. He had the silence, and he had the girl. And for a man who had spent his life with nothing, that was everything. "I spent my life thinking that the world was divided into the hunters and the hunted, the loud and the quiet. I thought that if you didn't have a voice that shook the stars, you didn't matter. But in that waste zone, I realized that the loudest thing in the universe isn't a psychic scream or a dying star. It's a choice. It's the moment you decide that another person's life is worth more than your own comfort. I've always been afraid of being broken, of being the one who couldn't hear the song. But maybe being broken is just how the light gets in." The vertical climb through the waste processing vents was an exercise in pure mechanical agony. The exhaust fans were the size of small moons, spinning with a low guttural roar that threatened to liquefy a man's internal organs. Jackson Vance felt every one of his 37 years as he hauled himself up the rusted rungs of the maintenance ladder, his muscles screaming beneath his tactical suit. Lumina was tethered to him with a length of high-tensile cargo webbing, her smaller frame pressed against his back. He could feel her heartbeat through the plating, a frantic, bird-like flutter that told him the psychic pressure outside the lead-lined vault was beginning to climb again. 30 meters to the secondary catwalk, Jackson wheezed, his voice sounding like sandpaper over the internal comms. "Just keep your eyes on my neck, princess. Don't look at the blades." The blades of the central fan were 20 meters below them, a swirling vortex of serrated titanium that pulverized station trash into dust. If the magnetic lock on his boots failed now, they wouldn't even have time to scream before being recycled into the station's carbon scrubbers. "You are making a lot of noise, Jackson," Lumina whispered into his ear. "Not the head noise, the body noise. Your heart is very loud." Yeah, well, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting right now, Jackson grunted, reaching for a rung that was slick with hydraulic fluid. His hand slipped, and for a terrifying half-second, he swung outward over the abyss. Lumina gasped, her arms locking around his neck like a vice. Steady, he barked, his boot magnet slamming back onto the ladder with a metallic clang. I've got us. Just a little grease, that's all. He hauled them upward, the air growing colder as they approached the service bay's atmospheric seal. Every meter felt like a kilometer. He thought about Kale's offer, 100,000 marks. It was a king's ransom. He could have bought a moon in the outer rim for that kind of scratch. He could have walked away from the grease, the rust, and the constant gnawing fear of being found out. But as he felt Lumina's breath on his neck, he realized those marks felt like lead in his pockets. They were the price of his soul, and for the first time in his life, Jackson Vance decided his soul wasn't for sale. They reached the catwalk and rolled onto the grated floor. Jackson stayed down for a moment, his chest heaving. He checked his wrist comms. The service bay was less than 500 meters away. The drift ghost was sitting there, waiting for them, hopefully with enough fuel in the secondary tanks to hit the jump gate before the arbitrator's fleet could lock them down. We're almost out, he said, unlinking the tether. He looked at Lumina. She was pale, the iridescent patterns on her skin flickering like a dying candle. The cloak he had given her was shredded, revealing the elegant, high-collared architect's suit beneath. She looked like a fallen god sitting in a pile of industrial trash. Jackson, she said, her amber eyes searching his face. Why did that man call me the enemy? Jackson wiped a smear of grease from his visor. Because it's easy, he said. Because if you're the enemy, then we don't have to care if you're hurting. If you're just an ether-born architect, then you're just a target. But if you're just a girl who's scared of the noise, he trailed off, unable to find the words. He wasn't a man of philosophy. He was a man of kinetic energy and applied force. It's about the signal, Lumina, he finally said. People out here, they only listen to the loudest signal. They don't have the patience for the quiet stuff. They'd rather hate a symbol than love a person. It's safer that way. She reached out and touched the scarred plating of his shoulder. And you? What do you hear? I hear a ship that needs to fly, Jackson said, standing up and offering her his hand. And a girl who needs to get home. Or at least somewhere that isn't here. They moved quickly through the darkened service tunnels. The air here was thinner, and the smell of ozone was sharp. They were close to the skin of the station now, just a few layers of carbonite between them and the cold, unyielding void. Jackson stopped at the final bulkhead. This was the door to Service Bay 4. On the other side was his ship, his ticket out of this hellhole. He checked his pulse pistol. 1 kinetic round, 1 ion. He took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the door's manual release. Lumina, stay behind me. If things go sideways, don't try to be a hero. You just run for the airlock. The ghost computer will recognize your biometrics if you're with me. Just get inside and lock the door. I will not leave you, she said, her voice steadying. Just do it, princess. He slammed the release. The bulkhead hissed open, revealing the cavernous, red-lit expanse of the service bay. The drift ghost was there, held in place by massive yellow docking tethers. It looked beautiful in its ugliness, a battered, scarred bird ready to take flight. But it wasn't alone. Standing at the base of the boarding ramp was a figure Jackson hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. He was tall, built like a mountain of scarred meat and cybernetic implants. He wore an old-model salvage rig, the kind that was built for heavy crust mining, and in his hands he held a massive industrial railgun. Vargas, Jackson whispered, his blood turning to ice. The big man let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded like stones grinding together. Well, well. Little Jaxie Vance. I told you back in the Arcturus belt that you had a habit of picking up things that didn't belong to you. I just didn't think you'd be stupid enough to pick up one of these. Vargas gestured with the railgun toward Lumina. Jackson stepped in front of her, his pistol leveled at his old mentor's chest. Vargas was the man who had taught Jackson everything he knew about salvage. He was the one who had shown him how to survive in a vacuum and how to find the valuable bits in a wreckage. He was also the man who had walked away when the Arcturus purge started, leaving Jackson to find his sister alone. What are you doing here, Vargas? Jackson asked, his voice low and dangerous. Earning a paycheck, son, Vargas said, his cybernetic eye whirring as it locked onto Jackson. 100,000 marks is a lot of credits for a man my age. The Etherborn, they've got deep pockets. They don't care how the job gets done, as long as the asset is returned and the Voidwalker is neutralized. You're working for the people who broke my sister? Jackson spat, the old rage bubbling up in his chest. You're taking their coin now? Vargas's expression didn't change. Business is business, Jax. Out here, you either eat or you get eaten. You should have learned that by now. That girl behind you? She's not a person. She's a high-caste weapon. She'd burn your brain out as soon as look at you if it suited her people's interests. She saved my life, Vargas, Jackson said. Vargas laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. She used you, boy. She used that black hole you call a mind to hide from her own kind. She's not your friend. She's a parasite. Lumina stepped out from behind Jackson, her iridescent skin glowing with a fierce, defiant light. I am not a parasite, she said, her voice echoing in the large bay. And I am not a weapon. I am an architect. I build things. And right now, I am building a future that does not include you. Vargas leveled the railgun. Touching speech, princess, but I'm more of a demolition guy. Before Vargas could pull the trigger, the air in the service bay suddenly warped. A massive wave of psychic energy slammed into the room, cold and heavy as a tombstone. Jackson felt the familiar pressure in his ears, but this was 1,000 times stronger than the specialist's search grid. The High Arbitrator emerged from the shadows of the upper observation deck. He was draped in robes of liquid silver that seemed to move of their own accord, and his face was a mask of cold, terrifying perfection. Behind him stood 12 retrieval specialists, their mirrored helmets reflecting the red emergency lights of the bay. Enough, the arbitrator said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It erupted inside Jackson's head like a physical blow, sending him to his knees. Jackson clawed at his helmet, his vision swimming. The pressure was immense. It felt like his skull was being crushed by invisible hands. Beside him, Lumina had collapsed, her skin turning a frantic, agonizing yellow. She was screaming, but no sound was coming out, just a raw, psychic broadcast of pure pain. Vargas stood his ground, his cybernetic eye flickering as he fought the influence. Arbitrator! We had a deal. I bring them in, I get the marks. The arbitrator didn't even look at him. Your services are no longer required, Dustcrawler. You have failed to contain the void. With a casual flick of his wrist, the arbitrator sent a pulse of energy toward Vargas. The big man was lifted off his feet and slammed into the bulkhead with enough force to dent the metal. He crumpled to the floor, his railgun clattering away. The arbitrator turned his attention to Jackson. He walked down the boarding ramp of a sleek silver shuttle that had been hidden in the shadows. He stopped 3 meters away, his presence like a dark sun. So, the arbitrator mused. The voice in Jackson's head smoother now, more invasive. This is the Voidwalker, a glitch in the biological record, a mind that produces no signal. You are a fascinating anomaly, Jackson Vance. Go to hell, Jackson wheezed, trying to lift his pistol. His arm felt like it was made of lead. I have seen your mind, the arbitrator continued, ignoring him. Or rather, I have seen the space where your mind should be. It is a quiet room, a place of absolute stillness. For centuries, my people have sought a way to achieve that level of focus, to be free from the noise of the collective without losing our power. You hold the key to that evolution. He looked at Lumina, who was shivering on the floor. And you, architect, you found the sanctuary we have been dreaming of, but you kept it for yourself. You chose a baseline creature over your own species. She chose a friend, Jackson gasped out. A friend? The arbitrator's lip curled in a cold sneer. A bird does not make friends with a rock. It simply rests on it. You are nothing to her but a tool, Voidwalker. And now I shall take that tool and refine it. The arbitrator reached out, his fingers glowing with a sickly violet light. Jackson felt a new kind of sensation, not pressure, but a pulling. It felt like the arbitrator was trying to hook into his very soul and drag it out through his eyes. It was an extraction. They weren't going to kill him, they were going to harvest him. Jackson looked at Lumina. She was watching him through her pain, her copper eyes full of a desperate, pleading light. "I won't let you take him," she whispered. She began to crawl toward Jackson, her iridescent skin flaring. She was trying to reach him, to touch him, to bring the silence back between them. But the specialists moved in, their silver batons crackling with neural energy. Jackson's mind was fracturing. The noise was getting louder, not the psychic noise, but the noise of his own fear, his own prejudice, his own history. He saw his sister. He saw the fire. He saw Vargas's betrayal. He saw the 100,000 marks. Then he saw Lumina. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't an architect. She was just a person who had looked at him and seen something worth saving. And in that moment, Jackson Vance made his choice. It wasn't a calculated decision. It wasn't a salvage job. It was the only honest thing he had left. He reached out and grabbed Lumina's hand. The moment their skin touched, the silence exploded. The collision of Jackson's void mind and Lumina's overcharged psychic potential created a localized phenomenon that the ether-born scientists would later spend decades trying to replicate. It was a silence pulse, a vacuum of neural energy that rushed outward from the point of contact, fueled by Jackson's absolute lack of signal and Lumina's desperate need for peace. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The 12 specialists were hit first. Their psychic barriers designed to filter and focus external signals were completely bypassed by the vacuum. They didn't scream, they simply fell, their mirrored helmets hitting the floor in a synchronized clatter as their nervous systems went into immediate, non-lethal shock. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on their reality. The High Arbitrator fared better, but only just. He let out a sharp, guttural cry, his silver robes fluttering wildly as he was shoved back 5 meters. His cold mask of perfection cracked, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. For the first time in his long life, he couldn't hear the collective. He was alone in his own head, and the sensation was clearly terrifying. Jackson felt the world turn inside out. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a wall. He felt Lumina's mind rushing into the space he provided, but it wasn't an invasion. It was a synchronization. He saw the world through her eyes, the flickering lines of energy, the structural weaknesses in the station, the beautiful, terrifying song of the stars. And she saw the world through his, the heavy, honest weight of metal, the smell of grease, and the fierce, stubborn loyalty of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Get up!" Jackson roared, the sound echoing through the bay. He hauled Lumina to her feet. The violet light of the arbitrator's extraction was gone, replaced by the soft, steady blue of their combined presence. Jackson didn't feel weak anymore. He felt like he was made of iron and lightning. He looked over at Vargas. The big man was stirring, his cybernetic eye cracked in bleeding oil. "Vargas," Jackson yelled, "if you want those marks, you're going to have to earn them the hard way." Vargas looked up, his face a mess of blood and confusion. He saw the fallen specialists. He saw the arbitrator struggling to regain his composure. Then he looked at Jackson, his pupil, the boy he had abandoned. Vargas let out a bloody spit and reached for his railgun. "I always did." "Hate the Etherborn," he wheezed. Vargas didn't fire at Jackson. He turned the massive weapon toward the High Arbitrator and pulled the trigger. The railgun roared, a supersonic slug of tungsten tearing through the air. The arbitrator barely managed to throw up a flickering shield in time. The impact sent him flying across the bay, crashing into the side of his silver shuttle. "Go!" Vargas screamed, his voice breaking. "Get that hunk of junk out of here, Jax, before they wake up." Jackson didn't hesitate. He scooped Lumina up and bolted for the boarding ramp of the Drift Ghost. He hit the manual hatch release, the heavy door hissing shut behind them just as the first of the specialists began to stir. He threw Lumina into the co-pilot's seat and slammed himself into the pilot's cradle. He didn't bother with the pre-flight checks. He just hit the emergency ignition. The Ghost's engines roared to life, a deep, vibrating hum that shook the entire service bay. "Jackson, the tethers!" Lumina cried, pointing to the massive yellow arms still holding the ship in place. "I'm on it," Jackson shouted. He didn't use the controls. He reached for the manual release handles, two heavy steel levers located between the seats. They were designed to be operated by two people, requiring nearly 400 kilograms of pressure to disengage the magnetic locks. Jackson grabbed them both, his muscles bulging, his face turning a dark, dangerous red. The levers wouldn't budge. The tethers were locked tight by the station's security grid. "Help me!" he roared. Lumina didn't grab the levers. She placed her hands over his. Her iridescent skin pulsed, and Jackson felt a surge of energy move through him. It wasn't physical strength, it was focus. He saw the internal mechanism of the tethers in his mind's eye. The pins, the magnets, the hydraulic valves. He saw the exact moment they needed to be released. "Now," she whispered. They pulled together, not as two people, but as a single coordinated force of will. The levers moved. With a sound like a thunderclap, the docking tethers snapped open, sparking as they whipped back into the bay walls. The drift ghost lurched forward, its thrusters firing at full power. Jackson grabbed the flight stick and hauled it back. The ship tore out of the service bay, scraping its belly against the airlock frame in a shower of sparks. They were out. The black void of space opened up before them, vast and silent. But the danger wasn't over. On the monitors, Jackson could see the High Arbitrator's fleet, 7 sleek silver vessels, turning to intercept them. "They're locking on," Jackson said, his hands dancing over the console. "We've got 3 minutes before they're in firing range. I need to spool the jump gate drive, but it takes 5 minutes to hit prime. I can delay them," Lumina said. She was leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the distant ships. "How?" Jackson asked. "They're 10,000 kilometers away." "I am an architect, Jackson," she said, her voice sounding old and powerful. "I designed the navigation protocols for those ships. I know the frequency of their collective. If I can reach out." "It'll kill you," Jackson said, grabbing her arm. "You just did a silence pulse. Your nervous system is fried." "Then we will both be fried," she said, looking at him with a sad, beautiful smile. "But we will be fried together." Jackson looked at the screen, then at the girl beside him. He saw the truth of her. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just someone to be rescued. She was a woman who was willing to burn herself out to save a scrapper who didn't even have a soul. "No," Jackson said. "We're not doing it that way." He reached down and pulled a small silver cylinder from his utility belt. It was the core processor from the Karis grid, the thing he had been hired to retrieve in the first place. "The navigational core," Lumina whispered. "If I can hook this into the Ghost comms array," Jackson said, his hands moving with frantic speed. "Can you use it as an amplifier? Instead of you reaching out to them, you use the core to broadcast a localized silence pulse. It'll act like a psychic smokescreen. They won't be able to lock onto us because we'll be a dead zone 10 kilometers wide." Lumina looked at the core, her eyes widening. It could work. But Jackson, the core is unstable. If it overloads, then will be the loudest explosion in the sector, Jackson said, cracking the casing of the core with his multi-tool. Better than being a lab rat. For the next 2 minutes, the interior of the Drift Ghost was a blur of activity. Jackson spliced wires, bypassed safety governors, and jury-rigged the ancient comms array to accept the core's massive energy output. Lumina sat in the center of the web, her hands hovering over the exposed circuits, her mind guiding the energy flow. They worked in perfect silent synchronicity. No words were needed. They were the architect and the builder, the signal and the void, finally working on the same project. 30 seconds to intercept, Jackson announced. The silver ships were closing in, their weapons bays opening. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she replied. Jackson hit the final switch. The Drift Ghost didn't fire a weapon. It didn't launch a missile. Instead, a wave of absolute, terrifying stillness erupted from the ship's comms array. On the sensors, the 7 ether-borne ships suddenly veered off course. Their internal navigation systems, their psychic links, their very sense of direction were momentarily flatlined by the silence pulse. They drifted in the void like blind giants, their weapons firing at shadows. The Ghost's jump gate drive hit prime with a triumphant hum. "Engaging jump," Jackson yelled. He slammed the throttle forward. The stars stretched into long, brilliant needles, and the service bay, the high arbitrator, and the noise of obsidian reach vanished behind them. The jump was violent, a wrenching sensation that felt like being pulled through a needle's eye. Then suddenly it was over. The Ghost dropped out of warp in the middle of a quiet, star-dusted nebula, thousands of light years away from any known trade route. Jackson collapsed back in his seat, his hands shaking so hard he could barely unlatch his harness. He looked over at Lumina. She was slumped in her seat, her skin a soft, pale blue, her eyes closed. "Lumina?" he whispered. She didn't move. Jackson's heart stopped. He unbuckled his harness and scrambled over to her, his breath catching in his throat. He reached out and touched her neck. She let out a soft, tired sigh and leaned into his hand. "I'm just tired, Jackson." Jackson let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the Dyson sphere. He leaned his forehead against the side of her seat and just stayed there for a long time. "We did it," he whispered. "We did," she replied, her hand finding his in the dark. Jackson looked out at the nebula. It was beautiful. Clouds of pink and gold gas, illuminated by the light of 1,000 distant suns. It was a place where no one would find them, a place where the noise couldn't reach. He looked at his hands, the hands of a scrapper, covered in grease and old scars. He'd spent his whole life thinking those hands were only good for taking things apart, but today they had built something. They had built a bridge between two worlds that were never supposed to touch. He thought about Vargas, staying behind to cover their escape. He thought about the marks he had left on the floor of the waste zone. He thought about the man he used to be. He realized that his silence hadn't been a defect. It had been a choice he hadn't known he was making. He had chosen to be quiet so he wouldn't have to hear the world's pain. But now he realized that being quiet wasn't enough. You had to be the silence for someone else. He looked at Lumina, who was watching the nebula with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. She turned to him, her copper eyes glowing. "What happens now, Jackson Vance?" Jackson looked at the navigation console. "We've got enough fuel for one more jump," he said. "And I know a little moon near the Perseus arm. It's quiet. No psychic networks, no trade stations, no ether-borne fleets. Just rocks and stars and, well, us." Lumina smiled, a real, honest smile that lit up her entire face. "I think I would like that very much." Jackson turned back to the controls, his hands steady now. He set the coordinates for the Perseus arm. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the arbitrator would ever find them or if the galaxy would ever change. But as the Drift Ghost began to spool its engines once more, Jackson realized he didn't care about the signal anymore. He had the silence, and for the first time in his life, the silence was enough. "I spent my life thinking that my mind was a hole in the universe, a place where nothing existed. I thought that being a void meant I was missing the most important part of being alive, the connection, the song, the shared dream of the stars. I spent years hating the Etherborn because they had what I didn't. I judged them as arrogant, as heartless, as the enemy. But in that service bay, I realized that the real void wasn't in my head. It was in the walls we build around ourselves to keep from being hurt. It was in the judgments we make before we even know a person's name. I thought I was rescuing a weapon, but I was just rescuing a girl. And in the end, she was the one who rescued me. She showed me that being quiet isn't about being empty. It's about making room." The moon of Velonis Minor was a place of quiet, haunting beauty that few in the core systems had ever seen. It hung like a pale sapphire in the velvet dark of the Perseus arm, its surface a mosaic of frozen nitrogen plains and jagged peaks of obsidian. There were no neon signs here, no atmospheric scrubbers humming in the deep, and most importantly, no psychic networks broadcasting the collective anxieties of a billion minds. It was a world of absolute, profound stillness, where the only signal was the slow, steady rhythm of the tides and the occasional whisper of a solar wind. Jackson Vance sat on the lowered boarding ramp of the Drift Ghost, his boots dangling over the edge. The air of Velonis was thin and tasted of iron and cold stone, but it was real. He had spent most of the morning trying to patch a structural fracture in the ship's primary fuel line, a parting gift from the service bay escape. But his tools felt heavy and his mind was elsewhere. He looked at his hands. They were covered in the familiar grime of a life spent in the dross, but the skin beneath the grease seemed different. He felt more present in his own body than he had in 37 years. The silence pulse hadn't just saved them. It had changed the architecture of his own consciousness. He was still a void, a man without a signal, but he no longer felt like an empty room. He felt like a fortress. "How's the arm?" he asked, not turning around. Lumina stepped out from the shadows of the cargo bay. She had discarded the shredded remains of her architect's suit and was wearing a pair of Jackson's old flight overalls, the sleeves rolled up several times to fit her slender arms. The iridescent patterns on her skin were a soft, steady gold, reflecting the light of the distant nebula. "It is healing," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "The burns are gone, but the memory of the light remains." She sat down beside him on the ramp, her shoulder brushing against his. Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't feel the need to move or to guard his thoughts. The contact was just contact, honest and simple. "I've been thinking about Vargas," Jackson said, staring out at the frozen plains. "He was a complicated man," Lumina replied softly. "He was a scavenger," Jackson corrected. "He taught me that everything in the universe is just parts waiting to be salvaged. People included. I spent 10 years hating him for walking away in the Arcturus belt. I judged him as a coward, a traitor. I thought I knew exactly what kind of man he was." Lumina looked at the jagged peaks of obsidian, and yet he stayed. Jackson pulled a small, battered data slate from his pocket. He found it in the service bay, tucked into a hidden compartment on the ship's boarding ramp. Cal had probably put it there before the arbitrator showed up, or maybe Vargas had slipped it in during the chaos. "Vargas sent a final packet before we jumped," Jackson said. "It wasn't credits or coordinates for a hideout. It was a medical record from the Arcturus Recovery Center." Lumina leaned in, her copper eyes focusing on the small screen. "Your sister?" "Elena," Jackson whispered. "Vargas didn't just walk away 10 years ago. He followed the transport. He used his marks to keep her in a high-grade care facility on the edge of the Perseus Arm. He's been paying for her treatment for a decade, Lumina. Every credit he earned from those dirty retrieval jobs went into keeping her alive. He wasn't working for the Etherborn because he liked them. He was working for them so he could pay the bills for the girl they broke." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of reconsidered history. Jackson felt a sharp pang of shame. He had spent a third of his life fueled by a hatred that was only half correct. He had judged Vargas as a monster because it was easier than understanding the tragedy of his choices. "I called him a mercenary," Jackson said, his voice cracking. "I thought he was the dross of the galaxy. But he was just another guy trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. He was a better scrapper than I ever gave him credit for." "He made a choice, Jackson," Lumina said, placing her hand over his. "Just as you did. We are not the labels our people give us. We are the things we do when the lights go out." She was right, of course. The humanistic theme that had been a whisper in the back of Jackson's mind was now a deafening roar. Prejudice was just a way to avoid the effort of empathy. It was a shortcut that led to a dead end. "I want to go see her," Jackson said. "Velonis Minor is only 2 light years from the facility. If the ghost can handle one more jump, I want to find Elena." Lumina nodded. "I will go with you." Jackson looked at her, really looked at her. "You don't have to. The Etherborn, they're the reason she's in that state. If she sees you, if she feels your signal—" "I am not the Echo, Jackson," Lumina said with a fierce, quiet pride. "And perhaps the silence we found together is what she needs. I have spent my life designing structures for stars. I want to see if I can help rebuild a mind." Jackson stood up, his resolve hardening like the obsidian peaks around them. He offered her his hand. "All right, Princess. Let's see if this old rust bucket has one more miracle left in her." They spent the next 12 hours working on the ship. It was a labor of love and necessity. Jackson handled the heavy lifting, the welding, and the mechanical alignment, while Lumina used her architect's intuition to optimize the energy flow through the ancient systems. They didn't use many words. They didn't need to. The synchronicity they had found in the service bay was still there. a shared rhythm that made the work feel effortless. As the sun of Velonis dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the plains, the drift ghost groaned to life. The engines purred with a smoothness Jackson hadn't heard in years. The ship was no longer just a collection of parts. It was a vessel with a purpose. They boarded the ship and took their places in the cockpit. Jackson felt a strange sense of peace as he gripped the flight stick. He wasn't running away anymore. He was moving towards something. Engaging jump, Jackson said. The stars stretched, and the sapphire moon vanished. The Arcturus Care Facility was a series of white sterile domes nestled in the valleys of a verdant garden world. It was a place of peace, of birdsong and flowing water, designed to soothe the shattered nerves of those who had survived the psychic wars of the core. Jackson Vance walked through the quiet corridors, his boots clicking softly on the polished stone. He felt out of place in his scarred armor and grease-stained vest, a man of iron in a world of glass. Beside him, Lumina walked with a grace that seemed to harmonize with the environment. Her skin was a soft, translucent white, and she kept her cloak pulled tight, though there were no Etherborn here to recognize her. They reached a room at the end of the east wing. A large window looked out onto a grove of amber-leaved trees. In a chair by the window sat a woman. She was 35 years old, but she looked much older. Her hair was shot with gray, and her eyes were fixed on a point in the distance that no one else could see. "Elena," Jackson whispered. The woman didn't turn. She didn't blink. She was a shell, just as he had described. The psychic purge had wiped the slate clean, leaving behind a body that forgot how to be a person. Jackson knelt beside her, taking her hand. It was cold and limp. "It's me, Elena. It's Jackson. I'm back." There was no response, not even a flicker of recognition. Jackson felt the old anger trying to rise, the familiar urge to find someone to blame, someone to hit. He looked at Lumina, who was standing by the door. "I did this," she said softly. "Not me personally, but my people. We broke her to find a secret that didn't exist." Jackson looked at his sister, then back at Lumina. "No," he said, his voice steady. "The arbitrator did this. A system that values signals over souls did this. But you're not that system." He stood up and stepped aside. "Can you reach her without breaking what's left?" Lumina approached the chair. She looked at Elena with a look of profound, aching compassion. She didn't reach for the woman's mind with the sharp, invasive focus of an architect. Instead, she sat on the floor and took Elena's other hand. She looked at Jackson. "I need you to hold us both. I need the silence." Jackson understood. He sat on the other side of his sister and took Lumina's hand. He closed his eyes and focused on the void within him. He made himself a wall, a fortress, a sanctuary. He opened the door to the quiet room in his head and invited them both in. He felt the connection form. It wasn't a shout or a scream. It was a soft, steady hum. He felt Lumina's presence, warm, blue, and incredibly gentle, moving through the silence toward the cold, dark emptiness that was Elena. It took hours. The sun moved across the sky, casting long, amber shadows across the room. Jackson's muscles cramped, and his head throbbed with the effort of maintaining the anchor. But he didn't move. He felt Lumina's energy flickering, her skin pulsing with a rhythmic gold light as she searched for a thread of Elena's original self. And then he felt it. It was a tiny, fragile vibration, a single note of music in the dark. It was a memory of a song, a smell of rain, the touch of a brother's hand. Jackson. The word was a breath, a ghost of a sound. Jackson opened his eyes. Elena was looking at him. Her eyes were still clouded, still distant, but she was looking at him. Her fingers twitched in his hand. "Jax, she whispered. "I'm here, Elena," Jackson said, tears blurring his vision. "I'm right here." She didn't wake up fully. She didn't stand up and embrace him. The damage was too deep for a miracle, but the shell had a crack in it. The silence had provided a bridge, and for the first time in 10 years, Elena Vance wasn't alone. Lumina slumped back against the chair, her iridescent skin pale and exhausted. She looked at Jackson and smiled, a tired, beautiful smile that held all the hope in the galaxy. She is there, Lumina whispered. She is very deep, but she is there. They stayed at the facility for several weeks. Jackson used the remaining marks from his salvage accounts to ensure the facility would be funded for another 50 years. He spent his days sitting with Elena, telling her stories of the stars, of the Carrie's grid, and of the silver-skinned girl who had taught him how to hear the quiet. He didn't wear his armor anymore. He traded his pulse pistol for a set of gardening tools. He worked in the amber-leaved grove, helping the staff maintain the grounds. He found that he liked the feeling of soil beneath his fingernails better than the feeling of grease. Lumina stayed with him. She became a familiar sight in the gardens, a silver ghost who spoke to the trees and the wind. She spent hours with the other survivors, using her new understanding of the silence to help them find their way back to themselves. She was no longer an architect of Dyson spheres. She was an architect of healing. One evening, as the two suns of the garden world were setting, Jackson and Lumina sat on a stone bench overlooking the valley. The Drift Ghost sat in a nearby hangar, its engines cold and its tethers locked. It was a relic of a past life, a ship that had done its duty. "I think I'm going to stay here for a while," Jackson said, looking at his hands. Elena's starting to remember the songs. She smiled today, a real smile. Lumina leaned her head on his shoulder. "It is a good place to be, Jackson. The noise is very soft here." Jackson looked out at the stars, which were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. He thought about the arbitrator, the specialists, and the 100,000 marks. They felt like a dream from someone else's life. "I spent 37 years thinking I was a void," he said. "I thought I was a hole where a person should be. I spent so much time judging everyone else for being loud that I forgot to listen to what they were actually saying. I thought the silence was my curse, but it was my gift. It was the only thing I had that was truly mine." He turned to Lumina, his amber eyes clear and full of peace. "I realized that the silence isn't an absence of sound. It's an absence of ego. It's the space you make for someone else to exist. I was so afraid of being broken that I didn't realize that being broken is the only way to let the light in. I used to be a scrapper, Lumina. I used to look for the value in things that were already gone. Now I'm looking for the value in what's still here." He reached out and took her hand, their fingers intertwining in the twilight. "I've looked back at the trail I left behind, the grease, the kinetic bolts, the broken contracts, and the anger I carried like a shield. I thought that shield was protecting me, but it was just keeping me cold. I judged Vargas for his silence, I judged the Etherborn for their noise, and I judged myself for being nothing at all. But on that dying star, I didn't find a weapon or an asset. I found a mirror. Lumina showed me that my void wasn't a defect, it was a sanctuary. We spend our whole lives trying to be heard, trying to broadcast our signal into the dark, thinking that's what makes us real. But real life happens in the spaces between the signals. It happens in the quiet moment when you decide to hold a hand instead of a gun. It happens when you stop looking for an enemy and start looking for a person. I am still a man of metal and rust, but for the first time, I am not afraid of the dark. Because in the dark, you can finally see the stars." Jackson looked at the distant horizon, a small, honest smile touching his lips. "I wonder, what is the silence you've been afraid to let someone into? We all have those quiet rooms in our heads, the parts of ourselves we think are empty or broken or not enough. We broadcast our noise to drown out the fear of our own void. But what if that void is exactly where your heart is waiting to be found? What would happen if you stopped performing and just let yourself be quiet? Who would you find waiting for you in that silence?" Jackson stood up and picked up a small, fallen amber leaf. He placed it gently in Lumina's hand, then turned to walk back toward the room where his sister was waiting. He didn't look back at the ship or the stars. He just walked toward the light in the window, his footsteps steady and sure. He was Jackson Vance, a man of the silence, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The garden whispered as the wind moved through the leaves, a soft, melodic sound that was not a scream, but a song. And in the heart of the Perseus arm, the silence was finally full.